Well, this is being recorded for posterity, so I guess we should go ahead and get started. And if people come in late, they'll just come in late. So thank you all for attending. This is kind of the first one of these I'm doing. Welcome to the think tank. My idea here is really, there's a lot of different ways to talk about what's going on right now in sort of the world of cloud and cloud native, right? I think we've actually lost out on a bit by losing kind of that hallway track experience at different conferences and people, you'd see someone and then 6 months later you'd see them again, or a year later you'd see them again. You'd talk and say, hey, what you working on? What's going on? And that kind of active sharing and listening, that meant a lot to me personally. And obviously with the pandemic having gone the way it's gone, those events are kind of few and far between. So I wanted to get together some people I know, some people I don't know, and ask them some questions and see how, see if we can all find some new understanding. So today, our first topic, or our first show, I guess, is going to be about cloud native observability, about the future of cloud native observability. And to talk to me about this, I have two excellent human beings, Ben Sigelman, CEO, Lightstep. I actually don't know what your title is now officially after the acquisition.
That's a good question. I just say co-founder of Lightstep, and then I usually make a joke about how I tried to be the CEO, but ServiceNow wouldn't let me do it anymore. So
yeah,
I'm general manager. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, co-founder of Lightstep, formerly Google, helped create Dapper, did a lot of cool observability distributed tracing stuff, and also joining us is Dr. KellyAnn Fitzpatrick from RedMonk.
Hey all.
So,
and I guess
yeah.
I should be like, okay, what RedMonk is real quick. Industry analyst firm. Basically, we follow tech trends and we specifically care about that kind of tech landscape from the perspective of practitioners like developers.
Fantastic. Yeah. RedMonk, great people, love them all. One of these days, Bunktoberfest will ride again, and we will all go have a beer together. It'll be fantastic. Hopefully this year.
Hopefully.
Knock on wood, everyone. With our introductions out of the way, let's get into it. So, just for everyone's kind of future, for how I want to do this at least. For the first little bit of this, I just kind of want to have some prepared questions that you two, the three of us, can talk about, and then once we get done with those, I'll open the floor up, and if people have like questions or comments or want to add something, then we'll do that then. So take notes, I guess, if you want to come back in later. Let's start off with the obvious one. What is observability to you? There's been, I was actually doing research on this morning. If you look over kind of like a 5 or 10 years in the world of developer tooling, APM, monitoring, whatever, observability has kind of gone from this very niche sort of topic to, seems like you throw a rock now and you're going to hit an observability startup, right? Or you're going to hit a very large company that has rebranded to become an observability company. So I'm wondering, is there a single useful general definition of observability that we can all agree on? Or are we a little too far into the hype cycle for that now? Ben, Kelly, whichever one of you wants to start?
Dr. Kelly, you want to go first?
You are too kind. And I think my perspective on this is I as an analyst am not kind of sitting within the viewpoint of a specific vendor or a specific technology, which for me makes this an even more, I think, open question, because I don't have a perspective of observability that I'm trying to sell, or one that I've helped even kind of found which I think some folks have. And I think there's a couple different ways to go from it. Is I always like going back to the kind of control theory definition of observability as kind of understanding a system from its outputs, because I think that's one that gives us a lot of flexibility and can give us a lot of flexibility as the observability landscape and the tooling, kind of within it and what it's capable about, like it expands from here. But I think it's also useful to think of observability in terms of negative definitions. So you have folks who are very adamant that observability can and should not be defined by this like 3 pillars model of like logs, logs, traces, and metrics. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it as well, because clearly there are people who do like to define it in that way for various reasons. So yeah, I think I'll pause there because I feel like, Ben, you have a lot to add to this.
Oh, I don't know about that part, but the adding part. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think about this a lot. Austin, your question mentioned that this is so far along the hype cycle that it's difficult. I mean, that's absolutely the case, unfortunately. If I had to step back and talk about observability really broadly, like not just talking about production software or cloud native software, the control theory definition from the 60s is, the most academically accurate thing I guess we can go back to. But maybe one way to explain it would be that observability is, trying to understand something without changing it, right? So it used to be the case that you would like attach a debugger to a process running on your own box. And that provided a really high level of observability because you could like inspect stack and even stop the process and look around and stuff like that, right? And now we're trying to do that for production software, and it's hard, right? Now, in terms of the a more practical definition, I mean, I guess the simplest way I'd put it is that observability is about understanding changes and forecasting changes in production software. That's really what it comes down to, and doing so without becoming an expert on how the tooling is built, and just being able to follow a guided path like that. That's what observability should be. But it's absolutely the case that a number of really large vendors have acquired their way into a quote unquote platform play, and then they call that observability. And if you have enough people doing that with different definitions, it gets pretty muddled. So yeah, it's a problem.
And just jumping in, I love that. And just thinking of it as from that kind of Clayton Christensen jobs to be done perspective, that, what is it that devs and SREs need to do their jobs and to be able to make changes and figure out what's going on, because of those changes, because as software becomes more complex, there are more changes to be made during like every cycle.
Yeah, I think that's both really good points. One thing I actually really want to circle back on is, we're talking about complexity, right? And I think the past couple of years have shown, if we just pick a point in time, right? Let's arbitrary point in time, say March 2020, right, where we had this sudden, very large change in how we work, and because of that change, because we had this shock to not only the economy, not only to the world, but like a pretty fundamental shock in how a lot of us worked and how knowledge was transferred, right? Because I think there's still a model that in most people I've talked to, and most software team, most development teams, you still you have this tribal knowledge, right? You've got something breaks, and maybe you've codified all that into a run book, maybe you haven't, and so you're going and you're saying like, who knows what broke? Who knows how to fix this? How many times have you said like, something happened and who's seen this before? Because we always have to go back to those people in organizations, those kind of individuals that have shepherded these complex systems from wherever they were to wherever they are now. So observability, I think, has been kind of a part of that, or maybe it hasn't been as much of a part of that transition as it should be, as we've kind of moved towards like this much more distributed world. but I think that maybe that also helps explain why, like, we see things getting more complex. We see, the nature of how we're actually interacting with these systems. Like you said, Ben, it used to be you would, if you wanted to know what was going on in prod, you would need to attach a debugger and so on and so forth. You would need to halt production in some way, or you would need to kind of set up a production-like environment that you could replicate this on. So I think that's why we're seeing those rebrandings. I also think why you're seeing like people that maybe traditionally, it's a live debugger, so now it's an observability thing. It's a network inspection thing, so now it's an observability thing, right? What does that mean for the future of both the observability space, but also maybe dev tooling in general, that observability is kind of it's like a foam, right? It's filling these cracks in the dev tool landscape.
And I can defer to Ben on this one because I feel like I got to go first last time.
It's a real privilege to go second, though, because then I have more time to think. I don't know, Austin, you packed a lot of stuff in there. I'm not going to try and address all of it, but I would say I actually don't really, frankly, think the pandemic has a whole lot to do with the trend to rebrand everything as observability. I think part of it is just, I don't know, buyer behavior and it's seeming like a new cool thing. But I think the trend towards observability really began more with the trend towards distributing teams and distributing software development and parallelizing software development. Maybe the pandemic helped that along a little bit, but I think the main driver for the move to let's call it cloud native technology was about increasing release velocity. Like that's ultimately from a business standpoint, the reason why cloud native makes sense is that you can take, 1,000 people who are developing software and split them into smaller teams that can operate with some independence. I mean, limited independence, but some independence, and that increases velocity. And then the natural side effect of the increase in velocity is that you go from deploying once every 6 months or once every month or even once every 2 weeks to deploying thousands of times per day if you're talking about like individual CI/CD deployments in some organizations. And that change rate, especially given that the changes can appear anywhere in the stack, creates so many opportunities for unintended side effects. And that's when observability comes into play. So in my mind, the pandemic, I guess it might have hastened the move to distributed teams because they're physically distributed and communication-wise more distributed. So maybe that was like a bump towards cloud and cloud native. But I think the cloud native and distributed teams trend is really what created the need for what I would call true observability, like understanding change across team boundaries and system boundaries. And then because there's so much money racing into that category, you do see, I think the foam analogy is good, Austin. You see all sorts of other tooling that felt a bit niche is, trying to rebrand itself as observability because then you become part of this larger category, which improves access to funding and things like that. But I mean, that's a bit cynical, but that's how I see it.
Yeah. I think I think you actually got to what I was trying to say with the pandemic stuff about like, hey, everyone's distributed now, right? Maybe it feels a little bit different depending on, I work at cool San Francisco startup that was, very heavily remote or remote friendly, but a lot of people that moved into a remote work situation weren't necessarily in the same boat. But yeah, you got what I meant. Kelly, you have anything to add on this?
I always have things to add.
Excellent.
And I also really like the kind of the foam analogy, this is the spaces like in between all these things, because I think that what we are seeing with observability and the kind of collapse of what used to be these kind of distinct categories into this kind of observability bucket is something that we're seeing in tech in other spaces as well. The kind of, we have so many pieces of like little niche tooling for different things that, at some point putting them together in a larger bucket, which I think Ben, as you put it, that it's something that can then be like understandable and then kind of marketed in different ways. I think that's a large part of a larger trend. For observabilities, kind of specifically, I agree that the pandemic is probably not the only thing that affected this at all, but it certainly has evolved an appetite for kind of adopting cloud native kind of architectures and way of doing things from folks who before may not have been ready to do so. But we've heard stories of companies that had absolutely no mechanism for just going about their day-to-day kind of business from without having people there on site, and folks like that had to adapt very quickly. And the stories of people having to do that and the amount of mind share that they moved to kind of distributed work, and even this kind of adoption of different types of architectures kind of happening at the same time, and, that has created like opportunities for technology buckets like observability to end up, I think, being something that people are willing to pay for where they would not have been willing to do so before.
Yeah, great points. So let's start, let's kind of dive into this a little bit. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about is where, what the pain points are. Not so much that the pain points that lead you to adopt observability practice or start to, like Ben said, you want to know what's changed, right? You need to know what's changed. So you kind of have these table stakes of like, well, I know there's this problem I have, and I know that I need to answer, to solve it. But when it comes to the actual implementation, you start putting the rubber to the road, so to speak. What do you see as like let's maybe pick one or two things that hold observability back at like that individual level and also at a leadership level. And maybe they're the same thing. I don't know. But where are the real road, the blockers in your mind right now?
Well, I guess I'll go first. I'd like to restrict the question to observability for, applications that are starting to distribute the work across multiple services and teams, right? So the cloud native applications.
Yeah, totally.
Otherwise, it's just too broad of a question, I think, for me to take a crack at it. But I guess there's a lot of discussion out there, and I'm probably part of the problem, not the solution here, of like, very highfalutin, sophisticated aspects of observability and best practices and so on and so forth. But when you go and actually look at what's happening on a team by team basis, there's still like a struggle, I think, just to get like an adequate signal quality out of the data. There's like a lot of really poor data that's coming in from sources that are manifold. And I mean, this is like a straight up lead into the open telemetry pitch, which is not a vendor pitch, but it's super, super important. I think having high quality data just sort of ubiquitously available is still holding people back quite a bit. Like a lot of the really sophisticated tooling that's out there works much better if the data is high quality. So I would say that's the first thing. And I think moving towards open telemetry as a standard, both for end users as well as vendors and other people in the ecosystem, cloud providers, et cetera, is like a really, really important aspect of improving observability for everyone. The other thing that I would say, if we're talking more about a persona that's responsible for thinking about ROI, so not just about features, but whether the tooling is worth it, there's a little bit of a dirty secret right now, I think, in cloud native observability, particularly around just the amount of data that's ever used for any purpose. Like if it's ever queried, we did the study at Google. We looked at we instrumented the query path, and something like 5% of the data that's collected was ever queried by a human being for any reason in the observability stack. And then the other 95% of it is really expensive, but kind of provably useless. Now, it's not an easy thing to necessarily predict exactly which 5% is going to be used, but it's not that hard actually to find the 50 or 70% that's never going to be used. And that's been something that I think incumbents have not been very eager to solve that problem because that's also their revenue stream. But there's a bit of a glaring issue, I think, around the ROI, particularly around high cardinality metrics and conventional log data that just doesn't scale that well in cloud native from a utility standpoint. And I think that's really holding back the practice because it creates a trust issue with the tooling, and then that turns into like artificial limitations on the way that the tooling is adopted and used in order to try and manage that cost in a sort of inefficient way. So that's my quick answer for you guys.
I mean, I can't disagree with any answer around observability that's like kind of pointing to data and the kind of access to data. And we're definitely seeing companies like Observ Inc, for instance, which is like built on Snowflake. And they're kind of like, all right, you can store this like giant metric ton of data at some kind of like reasonable cost, and you get the argument of against sampling, right? So you have companies I think are actually looking at observability from that kind of data perspective. But I think there are also, for individual developers who are not already into that kind of observability world and don't even kind of know where to start, I think there are perhaps still some other blockers in terms of individual developers dealing with kind of silos in their own organizations, right? In being the person who is trying to introduce kind of observability processes and practices in there. I feel that because we are tech, there's no tech without kind of like social systems around it as well. And it's like to be the person who's like, I want to bring this in there, and suddenly to have the burden of being the person who is responsible for this stuff working, to then somehow also potentially be the person who is inheriting responsibility for those systems working, for being the person who's there when outages are kind of there. I feel like there's a very complicated kind of ecosystem is the wrong word, but it goes beyond, I think, one little point. And I think we could very easily talk about this one question for the rest of the entire hour as well.
I would agree.
Yeah.
One thing I would say, add on to that, Kelly, is that, I shouldn't name like specific customer, but I was talking with like a giant financial institution, right? Like Fortune 10 kind of thing or whatever. And they're trying to, I was talking to someone whose job is basically to try and institute modern observability practices across this organization, which is pretty tough, right? Because the estate there goes back to like mainframes and then also includes totally serverless Kubernetes stuff, whatever, so it's like the full spectrum. And it's hard to do that, right? I think it's really hard to take something that's kind of, as we were saying earlier in this conversation, it's pretty mushy. Like observability doesn't have a very clean definition. And then, so this person decided to say, well, actually, I'm just going to go and try and I'm going to make this narrower and make this about SLOs. Okay, great. So SLOs, it's tighter, service level objectives. It's a little bit less mushy than observability, and it feels like that's, you can define what that is, and there's a project there. However, that also ran into trouble because it wasn't a priority for anyone except for this person to actually make SLOs something that cuts across the various, functions and roles of the organization. And then there's a third attempt, and this one actually worked, which is interesting, which was to say, well, I'm not going to talk about observability, although that's what I'm doing. I'm not going to talk about SLOs, although that's what I'm doing. I'm going to say, I'm going to go to this, critical line of business application and say, you have a problem in that you're trying to release software quickly, but you're creating a reliability issue, and you can't decide, like what's an acceptable amount of risk in terms of software release velocity. I'm going to solve that problem for you, and increase your release velocity for the PM organization while maintaining like acceptable reliability for the engineering organization, and built the deck around that. And that actually worked, right? Which of course is the whole point of SLOs, but it was like leveled up to something that made more sense to the business, at the altitude of the business and the leadership. And I think that actually was somewhat effective. And a lot of times when we're talking about, observability practices, or even some aspect of observability like SLOs, those of us who spend all of our time thinking about this, whether we're people like me, or you, Kelly, studying this from a vendor or an analyst perspective, or if you're like the champion for observability at your organization and are willing to spend your lunch hour or whatever joining this Twitter space or something like that, it's really important to remember that most people don't really want to think that hard about this stuff. And it's much easier if you can translate things to their language, which is like, we're releasing software too slowly, or our software is incredibly unreliable, or both, and then they were able to get some traction. But those sorts of imperatives are much easier for people to relate to. So I think that's really the point I'm trying to make, is just, I think the need to like always frame things in terms of velocity or reliability or both or whatever.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and it gets to the other part of Austin's question. So we started out talking about like the individual developer level, like what, right? And then tying into what may be holding observability practice back at the leadership level. And I think your point, Ben, is that they are related in ways that it can be really hard to kind of to sever.
Yep. I remember when I was working on Monarch, which was Google's multi-tenant metrics infrastructure. Basically, I was like way down in the weeds of figuring out how this was going to work, and had designed this. I won't go into the details of it just in the interest of time, but designed this like pretty elaborate, but in my mind, like incredibly elegant way to define schemas for the monitoring of these large distributed systems at Google, and I was pretty proud of it. The only catch was that it was really complicated, and you had to like read this lengthy document to understand all the nouns and verbs and so on and so forth. And I was like pitching it, and then this person, Manoj Palakal, was incredibly smart, sort of took me aside, and I remember what he said. He's like, people don't want to be monitoring astronauts. Like, they don't want to understand this. They just want to check the box and move on, which is true. It's absolutely true. And I think that those of us who are kind of on the bleeding edge of observability, it's important to remember that most people who are consuming observability don't want to be observability astronauts. They just want to get their job done. And I think that that's a very difficult and painful thing to remember, but also like critical for success in getting these initiatives to gain some traction in a brownfield environment in a real application.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to the earlier part of our discussion about, observability is becoming this kind of category where other things have kind of collapsed upon in it, but one that has more recognition, that's actually a good thing for anyone who is trying to, translate these kind of granular developer level concerns and idea of what observability can be to the kind of like larger business needs of an organization in order to get support for it.
So on that topic, let's keep talking about the enterprise for a second. Personally, like in a previous life, I was the guy that brought in monitoring to a program that, to a system that didn't have any. It was complex. It broke a lot. There was a ton of confusion about like, well, why did it break this time? And we had very poor observability into our system. And I got a hair up my butt because I got tired of waking up at 3 a.m. to deal with this. And I said, I'm going to bring in a tool and I'm going to set up some dashboards and you can go look at all the SQL metrics you want. And it worked out very well, except that people didn't actually use it. And that was a problem, obviously. So that's one, that's kind of like the observability champion at a low level coming in, bringing these ideas in and then not panning out. In your experience, or just in your opinion, is this something that is solved by having kind of that executive buy-in to begin with? Like, I guess what I'm really trying to say is, where does observability sit in like the enterprise? Is this something that, we should have this at the individual dev team level? Is this something that we should have, an existing platform team take ownership of? should there be a separate observability team, right? Kelly, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. And I love the narrative you told. It is a familiar one to me as well. And I think it very much speaks to the idea that when you're talking about software developers, it is very difficult to kind of walk in there and tell them what to use. And in fact, like one of my colleagues and one of the Red Monk co-founders, like Steve O'Grady, wrote an entire book called The New Kingmakers about kind of developer-led adoption, and how things like open source and like self-service kind of services made it so that developers actually have a lot more influence on the stuff that they actually use, partly because they will go and just use things without telling anybody higher up that that's what they're using. And getting to the point where all you have to do is convince your team to use this and just see how long you can kind of get away with it. And I think what you're talking about is the flip side of that, in that you just because technology or a tool or something that could be very useful is there does not mean that it is going to kind of get used. And part of that can be because of education, right? You set up a system, but at that point you may have been the only person who knew how it worked or what it could do. But also the idea of whose job is it to take on those responsibilities. And what we are absolutely seeing is that developers, like your typical even just app developer, is expected to do so much more than just write code. And the pressure for them to kind of take on even more is increasing. So you see things like shift left in security and shift left in, say, like testing. And then if something like being the person who's dealing with observability tooling, who decides where that lands? Is every single developer now supposed to have a base education in observability, in what it means and how it can be used and how it can benefit them in order to be a developer? I don't think we're anywhere close to that, at all. And what we tend to see, or what I've seen with the folks in the organizations that I talk to, is sometimes you do have that observability kind of champion where it is that type of single person, but often, it does fall to specific teams, and the names of those teams are changing as well. So it's not just ops teams. Sometimes you have like platform teams, or even DevOps teams, or developer experience teams. And I think that there's something to be said about having some type of idea or method by which observability can have this like base of knowledge within an organization or within parts of organizations, so that it doesn't become one of those things where nobody is doing it because everybody should be doing it, or it's somebody else's job.
I agree about almost everything you said. I would add to it with a couple of critical observations about observability in particular. So if we're talking about observability of an application that has many teams involved, the fact of the matter is that these teams are interconnected in pretty fundamental ways because they all work on a single application. And the kind of corollary there is that observability solutions, like no matter how they're constructed, need to be coherent across team boundaries. And that says a lot about the way that, to your question, Austin, I think says a lot about how things have to be structured. I think with open telemetry, we've shown that it is possible. I don't know how, it's not easy, and it definitely involves a ton of effort and coordination, but it is possible to get the participants in the ecosystem to actually collaborate and define conventions or standards, if you want to use the S word, conventions for how data is going to arrive in the tool, which is honestly the easiest part. But there are really three layers. There's the telemetry itself, there's the durable storage of that telemetry, and then there's all the workflows built on top of that. And to actually have a coherent observability, architecture at an organization, that experience at the workflow level ideally is pretty unified and is consistent across team boundaries. And I do not know how to do that in a completely, truly independent, dev-driven way until things are so commoditized that you could have something, some set of rigorous standards for how the different pieces of observability fit together, but we haven't even really defined what those are. Like we're still in like the second inning or something. I don't remember how many innings are in baseball, but definitely a lot more than two, right? So we've got a long ways to go, and that basically forces the issue of having a platform level decision about observability. Now, whether that should be an observability team or a platform engineering team or something else is, somewhat TBD. I think the hallmark of when it's done well is when that team shares objectives with people who are trying to think about product. I will say, and I'll stop talking a second, that I actually get a bit irritated about how much Google's looked at as an example of how SREs should be done. Having worked at Google for 9 years, I was actually very frustrated about how SRE was run there, in particular, with no fault to any of the individuals involved. The entire SRE organization reported into a completely separate VP who did not share much of a management chain with product engineering or infrastructure engineering, and so there was not a healthy tension within SRE balancing off product velocity and reliability. It was just reliability all the time, and that tension was only resolved in the cases of a conflict by going way up the org chart. I would say, regardless of the reporting structure, it's important that the cross-cutting team that thinks about observability and other aspects of platform needs to really share goals with the product team, or you can get into this world, like we were saying earlier, where there's kind of like a purity about the solution that's just impractical and can actually result in deadlock, I think, for the organization. So my vote is yes, central team for observability, regardless of what you call it. And also that team needs to share objectives with and collaborate in a really coherent solution-minded way with the product engineering organization.
Cool. Well, since you both kind of got us started on this idea of standards, let's talk about some standards. Some not actually officially standards in the IEEE or W3C. Yeah, some conventions, shall we say. Of course, I'm referring to Open Telemetry. For those that don't know, many of us on this space, I believe, have several vested interests or many hours sunk into this project, but it is a CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation project seeking to build effectively an open standard for the creation, representation of, software telemetry, things like application and infrastructure metrics, traces, and logs. So OTel, which is the short version of it, has been pretty exciting in terms of the amount of adoption we're seeing, both from kind of a vendor side and also an end user side. What do you see as maybe the three big things that OTel has either already done, or do you think it's going to do over the next, let's say 9 to 12 months to push this area forward? Start with Ben, since he's unmuted still.
Sure. Yeah, I'm kind of biased on OTel because I spend a ton of time on it myself. But for me, I think what I'm most excited about that's coming up soon, Open Telemetry has suffered a little bit from just the amount of interest in the project. I think that we were surprised by how much momentum we got from a committer standpoint, and now have over 3,000 committers or something. But we don't really have the project management apparatus that something like Kubernetes had from earlier age. But we're starting to get some of the governance pieces in place that will, I think, make the project more parallelizable and scalable. It's a bit of a meta benefit, but I think will allow us to hit roadmaps, that we have more consistently. So that's a meta thing, but I will say from the inside out, I'm excited about that. And I think what that will turn into is, from a delivery standpoint, is that I think we've already done a good job of GAing the tracing piece of this, and Open Tracing, which is the predecessor project for Open Telemetry, was finally formally deprecated and archived actually just this week. So it's really good to see that has happened. And then metrics, which everyone knows what those are. We've been working pretty hard with the Prometheus community to make Open Telemetry like a viable kind of co-participant in the metrics ecosystem, and to be um, uh, um, to be compatible with Prometheus deployments, and also like bring in the benefits of having like a multi-signal approach to telemetry. I think that's going to become a reality in the next couple of months, and I think will be a really good thing, because tracing was greenfield, but it's also a little bit of a nice to have for some organizations. Metrics like is an absolute must have, and I think having open telemetry, like offering its kind of pretty significant value proposition of having ubiquitous high quality telemetry in the metrics ecosystem, is going to be a really big thing for the way the whole landscape fits together, particularly since you won't have you'll never need to select a vendor because their integration surface again. You can just choose a vendor based on what they offer from a functionality standpoint, and let open standards take the place of like the integrations page. So I think that's a great thing for metrics.
And of course, I kind of insisted that Ben go first without even saying, because I feel like you have much more insight into like the workings of the Open Telemetry project than I do. For me, the one thing that I will say is Open Telemetry comes up in increasingly more conversations. So going from the point where I think I had only first heard of not just open telemetry, but open tracing or open census only a couple years ago. And now it's something where it's not just on my radar, it's on the radar of, vendors and, prospective kind of tech companies that come to talk to us. What I find fascinating is how companies are using their relationship with open telemetry in different ways. First, because it is a project, it becomes something that folks can point to and be like, look, I'm contributing to this kind of larger community and world of observability because like our organization is helping to contribute to this project, which I think in the small part, I think contributes to the like influx of, I think, contributions that maybe that you were kind of speaking about, Ben, which then leads into, okay, now how do we actually kind of manage all of this? But then also even companies who are not necessarily, who have not necessarily embraced that, we're all in on open telemetry, it becomes something that they have to address if they are framing themselves as an observability company. So it's very difficult for like any vendor to talk about an observability offering without at some point addressing like their relationship and understanding to open telemetry. And I think that can't be a bad thing.
I mean, I certainly, it's an interesting, almost prisoner's dilemma, I guess, from the observability vendor side, right? Where I think at first there was a lot of concern that, are people going to get behind this? And I'm pleasantly surprised at how many people have. Maybe it's due to the fear that like, oh, we don't want to be missing out, or, the cynic's take on this, right, is that everyone sort of realized, like Ben, you brought this up earlier, where instrumentation is, a requirement. You have to have code that instruments your code, and everyone kind of had their commodified, everyone had their solutions for this. Everyone had their agents or whatever they would drop in, and that was all pretty commodified. OTel means that maybe we can actually get that out of these specific implementations and upstream it into the libraries and the project, the products that people are using. And I think you're starting to see that, surprisingly, not just in like third-party code like Kafka or MySQL or whatever, right? Like there's been some stuff I've heard about them integrating OTel into their clients or into the actual servers. But also you're seeing it, companies like AWS are emitting OTel metrics, or at least allowing OTel as kind of a translation layer to emit internal metrics or internal traces through. So that's pretty interesting. And we'll see how that all shakes out in the future. I want to move on to kind of one last question for both of you, and then we can switch into, sort of an open floor. First off, thank you both. You've been fantastic guests. I think we've had a really great conversation. And I just want to know, what's the next big thing you're excited about, right? We're talking about the future of cloud native observability. So what's the next big thing for cloud native observability? Ben, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that next, of course, there's like a time horizon that we're talking about there, but I would say like we are nearing the point where open telemetry has crossed some critical threshold of ubiquity. And that's going to be an amazing, amazing thing for the space in general. Because I think um, once we have like high quality data everywhere, then the focus, I think, for observability will shift way up the stack in terms of what observability can provide and focus more on unification of the data. Right now, unfortunately, I think there's this pitch that vendors are making that if you are able to just centralize metrics and traces and logs into one vendor, then you've won. It's absolutely not sufficient. I mean, it is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I think what we're going to find is a much clearer articulation of what it means to do that thoughtfully and to actually join that data to, like, benefit the end users who are trying to use this tooling to like do something, right? Because that conversation right now is still very mushy and markety, and it's not based on anything that you can verify or even really try in many cases. So I think what we're going to see is a push towards unification at the data layer and the actual like workflow layer for SREs and developers who are on call to take advantage of like a much higher quality signal that's coming in from at the ground floor from OpenTelemetry.
Okay, going second is great because you have more time to think, but then you're like, Ben says such a great thing. You're like, how do you follow that in any way, shape, or form? But I'm going to take a slightly different kind of angle on it. And I think for what I'm excited about next for observability is, kind of like twofold. What are some of the evolutions of tooling that we get that helps, kind of improve that and make the kind of experience of, working with observability just better. So for instance, there's a company called like Lightrun that is very kind of developer first kind of company, and it's about working with in the IDE and being able to kind of change your instrumentation like from there without bringing down prod. And I think things like that are like a really good sign for where observability can go from that kind of developer perspective. But then I'm also just really excited to see what else like improved observability enables. And from this, we're thinking of things like there's a term called progressive delivery that we talk about at RedMonk. One of my colleagues, James Governor, is really kind of helped coin that term. And it's about like the evolution of continuous delivery, like that takes advantage of things like canarying and feature flags and A/B testing and these types of advances in the way that software is delivered that are taking advantage of these very kind of like cloud native technologies. And observability is one of those things that I think is driving something like that in terms of how people are building and delivering and experiencing software.
Cool. Great answers. Great responses, both of you. Personally, I'm also I'm just excited for what's next in general. I think we're at the, like Ben said, hotel. It's so close you can taste it, you can touch it. It's very cold and metallic. But once we get there, it's going to be, I think, a real revolution in what we think of in around observability as a product or tool. So first off, if you're listening, give it up for Ben and Kelly. You can go and tap the little heart emoji and do a little clap. Everyone loves to see that, since I can't see any of you, which is kind of the point of an audio only thing. The second thing I like to do, now that I have tutorialized how to access the emotion or the reaction feature, is if you have any questions or would like to say something on the topic, or if there's something that we missed during the discussion, go ahead and request to speak, give me or raise a hand, and I think that'll keep it up for you, and we can get you up here to say something, or at least Austin's gonna learn how to use Twitter Spaces really quickly.
Austin, I saw Louise and Jordan, I believe, both did the hand thing.
Did the hand thing?
For my UI, but then it faded away.
Yeah, I thought there's a hand raise that I think stays up. Yeah, like if you do the hand raise that's all the way to the right, it'll stay.
Interesting.
Multiple ways to raise your hand. Twitter Spaces is really encompassing the entirety of the human hand-raising experience. We'll give it another few seconds. Not seeing anything, but honestly, we'll take the 9 minutes back. I would like to say if you got a speaker request. Carlos, yeah. Hi, Carlos. You are on. If you'd like to ask a question. Yep, go ahead and unmute and.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the great insights, both to Ben and Dr. Kelly. I have a question on. I work with a lot of clients that are trying to modernize their applications from traditional and on-premise to cloud native. And one thing that comes up in some of the discussions as we do DevOps and modernization talks is about retention, data retention. Sometimes logs, but it could be other one, and that there are regulations or internal practices that tells them that they have to store that data for 3 years, sometimes 5 years, and most of them don't know what are the type of data they're retaining or capturing, and it brings problems around. Like I think Ben mentioned, like maybe 95% of the data is not really used ever, or nobody sees that. And just wanted to see if there's any thoughts about going to the future on making those systems more efficient, or reevaluating if it's necessary to capture that data, or the the how much data do you capture in the time series database, for example, if it's like metrics. I want to know like what are your thoughts on that in terms of Lightstep or Ben or Kelly.
Yeah, gosh, it's a good question. I mean, the thing you just said was definitely written by a lawyer, not by an engineer, right? It's like this, and even the very idea that like there's some amount of data that's the actual output of a system is completely false, right? It's like you've got whatever 99.999% of the things that are happening in the application are never recorded anywhere as telemetry. And if you were to log all of that, then it would be a complete non-starter, right? So, I mean, in as much as there's an opportunity to try to have a reasonable discussion with someone about that requirement, I think I would start there, just because it's such a preposterous idea, right? That you're going to retain everything for 3 years, given what everything actually means. That said, if you're going to like lose that argument, disks are pretty cheap these days, so I guess the next best thing is to try and separate the data that is written in a write optimized format, which is to say like a totally flat file, and stored away in some almost inaccessible place where it's really cheap. It's probably your best next hop. It's true that Lightstep has spent a lot of time thinking about this problem, and we have a bunch of stuff coming out this year to address this, where you don't have some kind of rather draconian requirement to like keep literally everything, but most that has to do with building a feedback loop from the usage of the data back to the ingest and the storage of that data. So what you'd like to do is to look at usage patterns, let them bake for some period of time, and then use that to build a model that will, given the type of telemetry, the name of the telemetry, the tags that are attached, etc., you can decide whether to keep it after aggregating, or just drop it, depending on various heuristics and usage information. And that feedback loop is difficult to build in isolation. Like you need to be able to have SREs like pounding on the system a bit to see how to do that. But I think of that as being the longer term direction for this stuff, to have a behavior informed model for which telemetry is useful and for how long. I don't know if that helps, Carlos, but I sympathize with the situation. We definitely had some similar kind of compliance issues at times at Google, and I've had that argument many times.
Yeah, that's very insightful. Meaning, models in general terms, you're saying like machine learning or AI models as they learn what to capture.
Well, I get kind of like sarcastic when I start talking about AI. I guess
no, that's why I was careful to phrase the question.
Yeah, one person's machine learning or AI is another person's like college level statistics. I think I'm talking about like statistics, but it's not like you need to build a neural network to do this or something like that. I mean, you certainly could, but you're probably going to overfit. Like I think you just need to have a data driven, statistically sound model. And if someone in marketing wants to call that machine learning, that's fine. But in my mind, that's like college level statistics.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the insights on Lightstep.
And Carlos, I think Ben is going to give you the most like practical advice that you can get here. But I have to say, I very much admired your use of emojis as Ben was speaking. I'm still trying to figure out the Twitter Space platform.
I just wanted to compliment Ben on coming for the marketers. We have it coming, although
the marketers and legal.
Yeah,
no, everyone. No, I'm just kidding. I love marketing.
Everyone is on notice.
It's done well.
Everybody's on notice today. Well, I think that's going to be, I don't think we really have time for another question, so I want to wrap it up. I want to tell everyone that, again, thank you all for coming and listening. You've been a great audience. There's honestly more people than I expected, so cool. If you want more trenchant insights about observability and so much more, please remember to follow our panelists. You can tap on their face, I think, to see their profile and follow them quickly from there. If you'd like to attend more of these spaces, I'll be doing a few more throughout February. Our next one that I've scheduled right now is going to be in about 2 weeks, and it's going to be about cloud engineering. I'll have guests from Pulumi and HashiCorp, so that's going to be a real exciting combination for all of us. No, they're cool. And then later in the month, we'll have one on cloud native security. So if you'd like to know everything I'm doing, I also tweet about pretty much anything that goes to my mind, including observability, cloud, general ship posting, what have you. Please give me a follow, and I will see you all back here next time for the Think Tank. So thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Boston.